Okay, welcome back. Um, we're getting into the sort of the last leg of the semester here, so hopefully everyone's hanging in there. What we're what we're getting into this module and probably the next module too are some ideas that we've kind of been hinting at and building up towards throughout the semester. So we've been talking about what are the benefits of trees and ecosystem services and things like that. But we've also looked at how some uh, some of those things are not necessarily distributed equally throughout cities, and I haven't really talked about some of the issues with that. But we've just kind of been hinting at it. So what we're going to get into is this idea of environmental justice. And before we can, I think in order to understand what environmental justice is, we kind of have to have an idea of what justice is in itself. And so usually when we're talking about justice, we're talking about how and what gets distributed in society, or how we construct our societies. If we want an official definition, how and what gets distributed in the construction of a just society is probably a good place to start. But if we're taking that approach, then I think some questions kind of just arise out of that. And the first is, usually like what really are we talking about here? So in terms of what gets distributed, that could come in a lot of different forms. And we're talking about um, well, I guess let's just sort of work through it. So, I think probably the easiest one to think about is wealth, but we're usually also talking about rights. Do certain groups have the same rights as other groups? And that might not be necessarily a spatial distribution, but sort of a racial or cultural distribution. But it could have spatial aspects to it. Wealth is also another one and I think that's it's tangible. It's kind of easier to think about. Some people wealth is not distributed equally. That's I don't think that's surprising to anyone. Um, but that in terms of justice, how like understanding the patterns of how things are distributed. Education could be another one, and this is definitely not an exhaustive list. These are just some examples, so you can sort of wrap your head around what we're talking about here. But you're usually talking about certain goods and opportunities and rights and how those things are distributed among people, and that inequality is a form of injustice in a lot of ways. And so, in terms of what we're talking about, could we consider ecosystem services to be a part of that? If we consider trees to be this resource, we just finished talking about ecosystem services. So, a given tree has a value to it in terms of the pollution that it removes, the energy that it might save, the mental health benefits it might provide, all sorts of things, stormwater benefits. And so if that's some form, if that's some resource for people, then we can say, is that distributed equally or not? And this is usually the form, this is kind of when we're getting into the realm of what environmental justice really is. Now there's other things like, hazard risk, and pollution zones and things like that. But that sort of gets out of the realm of urban forestry, and I think we're going to try to keep it here. And so, what we're really talking about in terms of environmental justice for these purposes is, are these ecosystem services distributed in an equal kind of way? And there's lots of studies that have been done on this. I actually worked on a study and published it last year with a colleague of mine from Ball State University, and we were looking at street trees in downtown Indianapolis. And we've talked about what street trees are. If you have a sidewalk and a street, sort of that grassy area that can be in between the street and the sidewalk, where trees are planted, that's almost always public right-of-way property, so that it's owned by the city, and they will plant trees in there, and they have certain benefits. They might reduce more pollution than say a park tree or something, just as a matter of their location. But anyway, there's important reasons for studying just street trees, because the government almost always, the local municipality almost always owns those, and your funding decisions and taxpayer money that goes directly into that, and so it's good to understand how those distributions are laid out over space. And what we found when we looked at downtown Indianapolis is that street trees are not distributed in an equal kind of way, which is not surprising. I mean, we've spent a lot of this class talking about how some of these things are not distributed equally. But if we want to look at specifically some studies that looked at that, this was one. And so I'm not going to go through every little detail here, but what we did was we looked at a block group, or sorry, a township in downtown Indianapolis, Center Township, and we separated by block groups, which, if you remember, are just sort of census neighborhoods. We used census data to get some socioeconomic data for these block groups, but then the city of Indianapolis also had a street tree inventory. So they had data on every street tree in this location for a couple of years. So it allowed us to look at a lot of things like, how many trees are in each block group, and what's the diversity of street trees in each block group, and how has these things changed over time. So it was a really cool data set, and we were able to look at a lot of things here. And again, I'm not going to go into every little detail, but the one figure that I think is worth looking into here is on the right side here. These are all tree variables. These are socioeconomic variables, but let's stick with the tree variables. We had tree density, which is just the number of trees per block group. We had diversity, so how many different species are there in each block group, and then basal area, which is just how large are the trees on average in that block group. And we had this data for 2 different years. And so what we wanted to know just in general was, are these things increasing or decreasing over time? And what we found for all 3 variables across most block groups, these things increased. So from 2002 to 2015, there tended to be more trees per block group. Block groups tended to have more diverse populations of street trees. And those street trees tended to be larger. So if they were planted, then they tended to stick. It planted in 2012, they planted to stick around and grew to get larger in 2015 when the second set of data was collected. So overall, you would think that's good news. There's more trees. They're planting different types of trees. The trees are getting larger, and that is good news. That definitely is good news. But the other some of the more nuanced things was, this is just in general. We wanted to know, are these variables being distributed equally throughout that area? And we found that they're not. And so here we're showing correlation values, and I'm not going to get into the statistics of this, but the takeaway was that block groups with higher education, higher income, and more housing units had more street trees. They had more diverse street tree populations, and they had larger street trees overall. And so if you did want to look into, and basically, this isn't all the results, but these are correlation values between, these tree variables and these socioeconomic variables, and, their level of statistical significance if you're a stats person. But basically we found, your education attainment, your household income, even the racial makeup component of your block group, those things are going to determine how many street trees you had, how diverse they were, and how large they were. And some of these things got better from 2012 to 2015. Let's see, so like percent owner occupancy and some other things, those tended to improve. In essence, like the correlations were lower in 2015 and 2012, so those trends weren't as strong, which you would think would be, a more equal distribution if you're not seeing those strong patterns. But other things didn't, and so the overall message is that there were a lot of patterns, and there were other results that I'm not going to force you guys to sit through. But this was the overall takeaway: is that they're not necessarily being distributed equally, and there's a lot of nuance in that. I think it's easy to sort of look at decision makers. Indianapolis has an entire urban forestry program, and I actually worked for them for a few years. And so it's easy to sort of point a finger at those people and say, hey, you're not planting trees where you need to plant them. And maybe they could be doing a better job of that, but there's also funding that comes into it. You just don't have as much money to do everything that you're going to want to do, which is another reason why I was stressing election stuff so much, is because it's really elected officials that set those fundings and determine what money goes where. And so if you're, concerned about the equal or unequal distribution of anything really, then you want to be paying attention to what's going on at the local government levels. So that was what we found in Indianapolis, and there are um, there's lots of studies, plenty of other studies. It's very common sort of approach to environmental justice is to look at the distribution of things, particularly trees and canopy distributions and things like that. But is distribution the only way? Is the distribution of goods or wealth or rights or ecosystem services, is that the only way to think about justice? Well, no, it isn't. So, that might be a good starting place to look at how things are distributed. But ultimately, what you really want to know is why are they, if they're not distributed equally, then why is that? And I think that gets at things like, are there structural biases built into the system? Are there certain groups of people that are not at being able to participate in the decision-making process? Are there certain groups that aren't being recognized and the value or just the recognition at all? Are you not really recognizing this group as something that exists? And so there's a lot of different ways to look at justice rather than only the distribution of things. But that's certainly one way to do it and a good place to start. But in the next video, we'll talk about some of these other ways. But for now, keep making your way through the module. There's a reading here and then a discussion where I'm going to ask you to sort of place this research within the distributional framework of environmental justice. So keep working your way through the module, and I will see you in the next video.